Hi, in this tutorial you will learn how to use simple cheese to create several complicated looking effects by using some very simple techniques such as animated textures, simple mapping techniques, or procedural masks. We will be going through the whole project from start to finish so that you can easily recreate something like this by yourself. Okay, so let me first walk you through the finished scene. So on the right hand side we have a static view of our sun, on the left hand side we have a turntable view of our sun, and we're gonna create 4 different elements for this tutorial, which I'm gonna show you now. So the first element would be the sun itself. So you can see this sun ball here with this fiery effect that's going on, this kind of burning effect. Then the next element would be this star field here, this 3-dimensional star field that you can see in the 360 turntable view here. And then we're gonna create 2 different kind of solar flares. So one is this kind of element here, where you can see like this kind of cloudy, wispy, explosive effect that's going on. And then the next element would be, or the next solar flare would be like this streaky kind of solar flare here, which is starting from one side and then going to the other side. So those are all the 4 elements that we're gonna recreate in this tutorial. And without further ado, let's now start with the sun itself. So here you can see the sun element by itself without any of the other elements. And what I want to demonstrate in this tutorial is that oftentimes it's much better to try to cheat your way through a setup, try to make it as simple as possible without having to build some very complicated or difficult to deal with setup. So let's start with a model, for example. That one couldn't be simpler. So you can see it's just a perfect sphere here. And then the final look comes mainly from the shading and from those post effects that are applied here in the frame buffer. So if you can see the original linear image that I'm rendering, it actually looks like this. And then with all of those post effects applied to, so those tone maps and lens effects, it will look like this, which already looks much more complex. But basically, it's a very simple to build setup. So huge part of the look comes from this lens effects here, of course. So if I disabled it, it just looks like this. And if you want to learn how to use those lens effects, I have our own dedicated tutorial in my channel that you can check out, where we go through all of the different settings here. If you want to learn about those tone mappings that are applied here, you can check out my studio lighting, where I discuss this a little bit in more detail. And now, without further ado, let's just start with a simple shading of this sphere here. Let me first show you, if I hide my sun, that I'm just using a pure black background color in this case. If I show my sun, you can see the render time. It's basically just a second or something. And the reason for that is that it just uses this V-Ray light material here with the intensity of 1, and then has this color composite map applied to it in here. So the reason why I'm setting the value here to 1 is that in the lens effect, I'm also putting my threshold to 1, and then I can define each pixel that has basically a value brighter than 1 will have lens effects applied to, and everything that has a value lower than 1 will have no lens effects applied to. So that's the reason why this one here is set to 1, even though physically accurate it should be probably millions or billions or something. But yeah, we just keep it simple, so put it to 1 here. And then inside here we have this composite map with all of those different layers applied to. And we're not going to go through every small detail in here, because I think that's maybe a little bit tedious, because all of this stuff is done very simple, and it's just much more important to get a broad understanding about the whole project so that you can understand how you can easily recreate something like this by yourself. So let me first disable all of those different layers in here, that we just have our base layer right here. And the most important thing is that I'm using an animated texture sequence, which looks like this. So you can see here, this one I did using After Effects. I just created this texture sequence right here. If you want to know how to do that in After Effects, there's a nice tutorial here from Video Copilot that you can follow. I will also put the link into the description down there. And then you can create something like this. And the only thing that I did additionally was to make sure that it loops. So you can see after 100 frames, it can seamlessly jump back to the first frame again. And this way you can use it for any kind of length that you use in the scene. So let's just now dive right into it here. This one is, the first step here is to create a V-Ray bitmap, and then just load this texture sequence right here, and that just looks like this. So I have this texture sequence here on my computer, 100 frames, and then everything is being loaded with this IFL texture sequence. And then you can define here in this time parameters, you can define a couple of things. First of all, it's the starting frame. So I started at my first frame here, which is frame 1001. Then the next thing would be this playback rate. So If you set it to 1, that means each frame he will load the next frame in your texture sequence. If you make a higher rate, then it would skip frames basically, and the animation would play much faster. And then the end condition here would be loop, so that means after the last frame of the sequence is reached, he will just start with the first frame again. And like this way, you can have this burning pattern basically repeating as long as you want in the scene. And then I just placed it here with this V-Ray triplanar texture here. So I choose a scaling of 500. For example, if you choose a smaller scaling, the texture will become smaller and smaller. But for this layer here, I just made like a bigger base layer, so a bigger pattern. And then the only thing that I added was this color correction here on top. So I just make it extremely contrasty so that I only get the bright parts of this texture and the rest will remain pretty dark or almost black. So that's the first layer of this composite map here. And now we're gonna check the next one. In order to see what's happening with the next layer, I will just create first of all a new V-Ray color map in here, just put it to black and then just put it on top of my base layer here so that everything stays black. And now if I put this one here to 100, I can only see what's happening in this layer. So what I did in here was to just add a V-Ray color in here. And then here I made sure to use a very strong color multiplier. So I set the color multiplier to a value of 20. And this will make sure that some of the parts will have very strong glare effects happening. And then I set a color that I liked. And then in here you can see I'm using a mask, and this time I'm using the same texture sequence that I was using before for the base layer as a color layer. I use it as a mask now. So instead I just desaturate the whole layer, I just make it very contrasty, and then I'm just using the same image sequence here that I used before, but with a slightly different scaling. So this one has a scaling of 350 now, so the scaling is smaller. And then I'm also using a different playback rate. So I have a playback rate of 2. That means this pattern will be played back much faster. So then I will layer both of them together. So if I now disable this additional layer here that I added to just preview this layer. So if I put this one here back to 0 again, you will see now both of the layers will be combined together, and I have 2 different scalings of pattern and 2 different intensities. So that's already making it more complex. And then the next thing would be, so now I'll just take up this black color up here, that we just preview this layer here. So the next thing is another layer which has a much smaller scaling. So I'm using the same pattern again. I'm using the same, or I'm using a slightly different color correction in here. And then I have a much smaller projection value here. And let me see, the playback rate now here is set to 4. So this small pattern will repeat even more fast, or will play through even more fast. So that's just layering like 3 different texture sequences with different scaling and slightly different colors on top of each other. And then if I put this one here on top and I just put it to 0, then we can see how those 3 layers below, how they now work together. And the blending mode is all set to addition. So all the brightness value will always be added on the brightness value of the layer below. And this way you can get this kind of effect. But one important thing is still missing, and that is the glow on the edges. So at the moment, everywhere it's kind of like glowing a little bit, not too much, but we need this very strong glow here on the edge. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you how to do now. So now we'll just add this one here back to 100 again, so that we can only focus about this layer here. And then if I put this one to 100, you can see the effect that this layer is generating. And let me just disable this mask here, or cut out this mask first. And then we can go inside here. And in here, there's just a simple fall off ramp with Fresnel fall off. And then I modified this fall off curve slightly, so I can get exactly this kind of effect. And then this one looks a bit too uniform. That's why I'm using this mask, but I will show you this in a second. The important thing is here, if you go to the color value here for the bright color, so that's the color that's appearing here on the edges, you can see I have a color value, and then I use a really strong multiplier of 75 in this case. So by this, I will just force the color or the brightness values here on the edge to become very bright, and then the lens effects will pick up this brightness here and make this part here glow more, while here in the center we don't really have this very strong glow. And then, because this one now looks a little bit uniform, let me get in my mask back again. So then you can see, as you guessed it, this mask basically is just the same image sequence again with a slightly different triplanar texture here applied to it, and a slightly different playback rate of 2 here, in order to make this one here animate. And because this one here is animated, you can see this edge here will also animate a little bit, right? Because I'm like multiplying the brightness of those pixels here on the edge with a mask. So once the texture is animated, also here the edge will look a little bit not so perfectly circular, but will also move around a little bit. Okay, and then if I now remove this layer here, and then we have those 4 layers here together, and then this one here is the effect of our sun. As you can see, there's one last layer here, which if I enable it, you will find it doesn't really have a huge effect or no effect that you can see, but this one comes into play when we create these different solar flares here. So I will show you this later. Now let's just briefly talk about the stars. If I unhide my star layer here, you can see now I have stars in my rendering, and you can see it's done pretty simple. It's just generated a lot of spheres around my sun object here, and I generated the spheres using a particle system and then converted it to editable poly. And then the only thing that is a little bit different is the shader. So here in this shader that I apply to the spheres has a little bit of diffuse color, a little bit of self-illumination. And then the only important thing is this opacity ramp here. So if I, for example, disable this, then you will be able to see that all of those parts here are just like these spheres. But with this opacity ramp, I'm using like this kind of fall-off map. So I'm basically just showing the center part of the sphere, and then around it I will make it transparent with a little bit of a fall-off. And then, yeah, the stars looks better, and you never get like these very sharp edges of the stars that comes from the sphere shape. So that's that basically. The only important thing is to put your opacity mode here to normal. If you put it to stochastic, it might turn out to have problems. You can see here some parts become very untransparent, some parts become very transparent. In this normal mode, this transition is happening a little bit better, but it costs additional render time. So I normally tend to use this one to normal, and I don't have to worry about any kind of artifacts that will happen. Yeah, so this one here is the layer for the stars, and now let's move on to the next one. So now we will talk a little bit about how I did the solar flares. Let me hide the star layer here first, and then unhide the first layer of those solar flares, which is going to be this cloudy explosive effects here on the edges. And you can see already here in the viewport how it's being done. So it's actually done quite simple. We have our sun object right here, and then I'm using a scatter object here that scatters all of those planes around my sphere from all different kind of angles. And then I'm using a shader to make it look more or less convincing. So you can see so if I'm rendering, it doesn't really look very convincing yet, but once the lens effect kicks in, it will blend everything more or less together, and it will start to look a little bit like some volumetric effect. So the most important thing for that is that we're gonna cheat the part where it would become visible to look like a volumetric effect. So if I now just go to this plane here, so that's the original plane that I used, and I'm showing the shader of that. So this one here is a shader, and it's just like a normal V-Ray light material with a color information and some opacity information here, and then I'm multiplying the color with the opacity. So the important thing that you need to think about is it is a fake effect, so that means it only looks convincing from certain kind of angles. So if I, for example, if I rotate my effect right here, where it wouldn't look convincing anymore, because then it's clear it's only a plane, then you will see that it automatically disappears. So I can demonstrate that very easy if I just hide the color information right here, and then I hide this layer right here in my opacity. So This way, I'm just using the texture that's in here. So I'm having a texture applied to here for the opacity, which looks like this. So it's just like this random kind of shapes here. That's my basic opacity map. And then if I would rotate it like this without this node right here that I'm going to show you in a second, then you will see that here on the sides, you will clearly see that this one is just like a fake effect, right? So you need to find some way to kind of hide this. So I'm having here this falloff map right here, which doesn't really change much once I look at it from the front. So it's just this falloff map with a white and black ramp and a falloff map right here. And then I'm multiplying this on top. So that's based on the camera angle. And then once I start to rotate my plane right here, at the parts where you would see that it's not a real volumetric effect, it will start to hide itself, right? So that's the important thing about this. And then in here, this one is just the normal V-Ray bitmap that we used before with this image sequence and animated with a little bit of color correction. And then you will get basically this kind of effect where you have the alpha from our original opacity map. It will hide itself once it's being rotated towards the camera. And also we have some kind of animation that's going on in here. So that's basically a breakdown of this solar flare right here. Let me just show you really quick how the scattering was done. So if you don't have some external plugin to do this, there's some option in 3ds Max that you can use, which is this option right here. So if you create any kind of geometry right here, and then in this extended, in this compound object, you can choose the scatter option right here, and then you can define a distribution object. So you could define, for example, the sun, and then it would like scatter this, box in this case a lot of times on this sun, and you can choose random scaling, random rotation offset and stuff like this. So if you don't have some special third-party plugin, you can use this way, which works pretty fine in this kind of simple scenario. Okay, so let's just hide this again, and then just one more thing. So if you start to use a lot of planes, for example, that use transparency, there's one option that is important here in V-Ray. So if you go here to this global switches tab, there's this max transparency levels value, and that's by default set to 50. And for me in this scene, it also works quite fine with 50. That means you could stack up to 50 planes behind each other, and it will still calculate the transparency. If you choose the value too low, that means that, for example, if I choose a value to be just 5, we could just make a test like this. So I just define the value to be like 5, and then you will see the transparency is not calculated correctly anymore. So because it would only go through 5 different layers of transparency, and afterwards it would just cut it out. So you just need to be careful, or you need to be aware that you need to increase this value. I think for most cases the standard value of 50 works fine, but if you run into problems where some parts of this would be not shown correctly, then you know you need to increase this max transparency level right here. So now there's one more type of solar flares that is left, which is those ones right here. These kind of 3-dimensional, tricky ones, and I'm gonna show you how I did those. The procedure is basically the same. You generate like one object that looks kind of convincing, and then you just scatter it around your sphere, and you can see I use different kind of scalings to scatter it all around my sphere right here. So let's hide this, and let's show this one right here. And then we can talk a little bit about this object right here. So while for the first solar flares, we just worked with this simple plane, this one now is a little bit more complicated. That means we use a 3D geometry in order to generate this shape. And the procedure is actually not that different because I'm also starting from a plane. So you can see this one here is my original plane object. And then it basically has the same kind of effect, that if I look at it from the side, it will start to disappear. And if I look at it from the front, it will start to appear again. And then I just map it. I just use these kind of different modifiers in order to get it into the shape that I want. So first of all, I just roll it basically into a cylinder shape. And then I add a FFD modifier on top of it in order to get the shape that I want. And then I use a bend modifier to bend it into this arc shape. And then remember, it's still a fake effect, so it doesn't really work completely from all kind of angles. But the most important thing is that you are hiding all of the problematic areas. So the most important thing is that the areas where you would see some problems, the areas where you would see that it's just a fake effect, you start to hide this, and then it actually will kind of blend nicely into your original sun model, and you don't see any of those problematic areas. So that's done with a shader, and I will show you in a second how this one was done. Okay, so this one is the shader right here. Again, it's just the V-Ray light material with the color and the opacity, and I used to multiply the color by the opacity. And then the little different part is here that I'm using the same map for the color and the opacity. So if you can go right in here, I use this composite map here that has these 5 different layers, and then I'm using the same map into here the opacity. So I'm desaturating the map, I'm giving it a little bit more contrast, but then inside here in the opacity map is actually the same map they use for the color map. So that's good for 2 things, because if you generate stuff that is more white in your map, that means it will become less transparent, and everything that's more darker in your map will become more transparent. So by this you can create some kind of convincing volumetric effect, which also helps is, by the way, that if you see this plane object right here, or this cylinder object right here, because it comes from original plane geometry, I have multiple layers inside here, right? So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different layers inside, which all will help to create some effect that looks a little bit more volumetric instead of something that's just like a simple cylinder which doesn't have like these inside parts right here. So that's why I use this bend modifier to just roll this plane into many layers and then curve it like this. Now let's quickly dive into the composite map right here. So let's just hide all of those layers before, and then we just focus about this one right here, the base layer, and that's just like a falloff map again with a front color which is set to this one, and the side color is pure black. That will make this effect that it will hide the edges of your geometry. So if you have a circular geometry, a round geometry, then it will start to reveal itself towards the center, but on the edge it will look like kind of half transparent. Like this way you could kind of fake some atmospheric effects or some volumetric effects. So let's just now hide these modifiers, because then it's a little bit simpler to see what's going on. So I have this other map right here, which kind of overlays another texture that I also generated using After Effects. So in After Effects, I created this kind of image sequence right here, where this kind of noise just travels up in some random shapes, and it also saved as an image sequence and also something that loops. So I can just map this here on top, and you will get this kind of effect that there's some streaks basically traveling through our geometry. And then the next layer here would be to give it some color, some different color variations. So this layer here is just set to color, and then I'm just using the original original UVs of the map, and I switched off this mirror function right here and set it to or I enabled this mirror function right here, so that on both sides the same changes would occur. So if I make this one, for example, to red, then on both sides it will change it simultaneously. So then I'm adding this one here to just have different color values in here, and then this layer right here basically just makes the side here on the edge more bright and the parts here in the center more dark, by just using this overlay gradient ramp. So the same thing here again, it also uses this mirror option right here so that both sides would be affected. And then if I just roll it back into the original shape that I had, and then you will get this kind of effect. And then the only thing that I added here additionally was this kind of map right here, and this I think is also best if we see it from this. So now we have the problem that I mean, this one, if we roll it, it looks kind of fine, but we still have like these kind of two edges up and down, which would reveal itself when once it's rolled into this shape. So I added this other fall off or this other gradient ramp right in here in order to hide those parts at the top, at the bottom. And then if you roll the whole thing together, then you will get something that looks more or less convincing, and now you're ready to scatter that on your sun object. Now I scattered all of those solar flares around my sun and everything looks fine on first sight. But remember, there was this one layer in the sun shader that I wanted to explain you later. So now is the time for that. Let me just demonstrate what's actually happening. If I just add here back a V-Ray color and I just make it to a black, then we can easier see what's happening. So at the moment now, all of those geometry, it's intersecting with our sun geometry, and we get these ugly cuts here, these ugly transitions, which doesn't really look very realistic. So I have this additional layer here on top that will try to hide those transitions. So it's done actually quite simple. I just use the ambient occlusion and then I just add these kind of solar streaks in here, and then it will look like it's coming out of some very bright part of the sun here. So yeah, let me just show you this part right here. It just uses this V-Ray dirt material or this V-Ray dirt node in here, and then I'm using a radius. So let me just disable this radius right here, then it's easier to see. And let me just cut this one out and just put a V-Ray color with a for example blue color, then we can see it very clear. So inside here you can choose a radius. For example, if I make it very small, then you see it will just trace around like these kind of rolls that we have from our from these kind of effects. And then if we choose a bigger radius, it will start to blend itself together. And the important thing is that you use, in this mode here, you use the inner and the outer occlusion. So by default it's set to this. Actually, this one also works kind of fine. You will just see some problems here if I use this one ambient and inner occlusion. Like these kind of stuff here will look a little bit nicer. And then that's basically how I generate the mask. And I just use this radius texture right here, which is again the original like image sequence that we used before for the sun. Then we can generate this kind of pattern that will change its shape over time. And then we just bring back our original texture right here, which is again the same image sequence from before. And then it will generate this kind of effect that this streaks are coming out from some very bright parts here on our sun surface, and you don't see these kind of cuts anymore. So then I can hide this layer right here, and I can just reveal our star layer and our solar flare layer here. And then you can see how easy you can generate this kind of effect, and you can get sun that looks kind of convincing, renders extremely fast, and yeah, then you're done with it. So now for the end, just if you find this content helpful, I would recommend that you check out my Patreon page, because there I upload all the scene files, I upload all the resources, I upload additional videos that are too long to release on YouTube. So if you want to check out this, I invite you to visit my Patreon. Other than that, please subscribe to this channel to be notified about future tutorials once they're released. And other than that, yeah, I hope you're doing great, I hope you're staying safe, and I hope to see you soon in the next tutorial. Take care.